You've heard of the information economy, the sharing economy, and of course, the regular economy. Well, tonight we're going to talk about something called the solutions economy. Shaun Loney is author of An Army of Problem Solvers, Reconciliation and the Solutions Economy, and co-founder of Build Inc., and he's with us tonight to explain. Welcome.
Hi, Nam. It's nice to be here.
Thank you so much for coming all the way from Winnipeg. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
It's very nice to be here.
So let's start with, what is the solutions economy?
Great question. We kind of describe the solutions economy breaking up into three categories: social enterprises, which are nonprofit businesses, and social entrepreneurs. And I give the example of Elon Musk. People
Tesla?
generally, as a private entrepreneur that's also solving social problems, and also the local food movement. And our group of our problem solvers are based around social enterprises, nonprofit businesses, and starting in Winnipeg, and the idea being to include Indigenous men in the economy. So the main problem we're trying to solve is unemployment amongst Indigenous men.
There's so many problems, and it becomes overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
But you say we shouldn't look at problems as problems. We should actually look at them as opportunities.
Yes, and I think that governments and society in general have forgotten that you need a problem solver to solve a problem. And we need to be focusing on problem solvers rather than the problems. And right now, governments make it very difficult for us to do our work. And
how so?
Well, food, for example, I want to talk a bit about, we have a social enterprise at Garden Hill. It's a remote First Nation where it's a diabetes cesspool. And it's one of the most beautiful places on earth, I'm sure, but the diabetes there is very tantamount. And it's 4,400 people, and about 700 of them have diabetes.
We're going to talk about that in just a little bit, but I wanted to read a passage from your book, if I could. Our national conversation right now is around the horrific impacts of residential schools, as it should be. But alongside the Canadian government's efforts to take the Indian out of the child was a range of other policies to take the Indian out of the economy. Too many of those policies still persist to this day. I believe that changing them is one important and very tangible way to work at reconciliation. What are some of the current obstacles to putting the Indian back into the economy?
Well, first of all, I think that Canadians, as we're learning about residential schools, we also need to know what was going on back on the res. And use the example of Stan McKay. He was a former moderator in the United Church of Canada and a Cree elder. And Stan said when his grandparents grew up, there were lots of activities they could do, economic activities. And they could fish and they could hunt. They could trap, and there was big game and farming. And at the time, what happened with his family is, well, the fishers only got half of what non-Indigenous fishers would get. They weren't allowed to sell any of their product off the First Nation without the permission of this Indian agent.
And this was because of the Indian Act? Or
yeah, and it's just a real effort by the Canadian government to suppress local economies of First Nations families. And I found that kind of alarming as a very privileged man, and it was very bothersome. That kind of goes alongside the residential school story. But then realizing that in our work, as we're trying to build local economies in inner city neighborhoods and in First Nations, that we're still doing this. In the case of energy on First Nations, there's a real, the federal government favors energy that's imported into First Nations where there's no jobs created, and whereas we're trying to get them to decolonize their policies so that they would actually favor local energy production and reducing energy bills and creating employment at the same time. But it's against the rules.
But why do you think that still is? If it's going to benefit the government, if it's going to cost them more money, less money,
I think
why wouldn't they change?
much of it's unintentional, but it's legacy of colonial governments where they have to maintain control. And the way they maintain control, in this case, the federal government is on First Nations is, well, if you want to do something, the First Nation has to apply for funding. So if I could, I'll just explain a bit our geothermal initiatives. We're working on 5 different First Nations in Manitoba, and we've done $7 million worth of geothermal work since 2013, and none of that cost any government money, no funding. And the way we do it is by having Manitoba Hydro provide us the financing up front to put the geothermal in, and then Hydro puts a charge on the utility bills, which they continue to collect until they get all their money back. And the beautiful thing about it is that the net bills always go down because the bill reductions are so big. There's lots of room to take some of those bill reductions to pay back the upfront cost. And in May of this past year, the federal government said, well, we're not going to allow you to do that anymore. And so we said, well, you're choosing high utility bills, which create no employment, over low utility bills, which create employment. And it didn't seem to bother them at all. It's like, no, if you want to do this, you need to apply for funding. So they actually offered us, we're working at the Wayway-Sikapo First Nation. There's 400 houses there, which are a great fit for geothermal. $8 million worth of geothermal work, half of that being labor, right on the First Nation, not costing the federal government any funding. And they said, no, you can't. So they actually offered us money to do the geothermal, and we refused it because we think that these are tools that should be available to all First Nations in Canada.
Well, I wanted to read another passage from your book, and it's about energy, and you write, it is important to understand the source of government policies that can create space for an initiative like the Rainy River Solar Farm. Rainy River was able to undertake their project because the Government of Ontario passed legislation requiring utilities to purchase green power from First Nations at a set competitive price. Such prices, when applied to renewable energy, can and should include value for the social and environmental benefits of the power. Now, recently, the Ontario government has been under a lot of pressure over electricity prices. How is that likely to affect the sorts of programs that helped the Rainy River Solar Farm?
Yeah, I think that with the Ontario Energy Act, I certainly would have done some things differently. But the main thing that people in Ontario need to realize is that people actually aren't that concerned about their rates. They're concerned about their bills. And so in Manitoba, Build Inc., as you say, that I helped to co-found 10 years ago, we've lowered utility bills at 16,000 low-income households in Winnipeg alone, and also doing it in Brandon. And we helped to set up a social enterprise here in Toronto called Building Up, and in St. John's, Newfoundland. And the Ontario government should be focusing on helping low-income customers lower their utility bills. You can easily cut the energy consumption in half. You're not worried about 5 or 10% rate increases if your bill is half of what it was before.
I want to bring our conversation back to privilege, something you mentioned earlier, and I want to read a passage from your book about that. You're right, most of us non-Indigenous Canadians, if we admit it, can trace our privilege back to the demise of First Nations. Many of our ancestors settled on ill-gotten land or benefited from resources to which Indigenous people had legitimate claim. We are part of a system that has worked better for non-Indigenous people than for Indigenous people. In other words, the economy and society itself is made for people like me to the exclusion of people who are not like me. Was that a difficult thing for you to write about?
Well, it's liberating in some ways, I feel, because with privilege you can do things, and it feels great to be a part of people's lives. The folks that I work with, and we've started now 12 different social enterprises across Canada, I call them heroes, so people who overcome daily barriers to accomplish the things that the rest of us find easy. And I get to work with people that are just remarkable in that way. But you talked about Rainy River First Nation. I grew up on their land now, and my family owned and owns a grocery store. The main block of customers is still from the Rainy River First Nation. So one of the reasons why I've had it so easy in my life is because of the demise of their local food economies. And so in a way, it is good to be able to make things right, and for us to connect our lives together, and for us to realize how our lives are intertwined. And there's a lot of richness in that.
I just find it interesting. So is that what motivated you to do the work? Did you maybe have like a sense of guilt from that, or?
I don't think it was a sense of guilt. I think it's just a sense of wondering. And I often say that some of us were on third base, but we think we hit a triple when we actually just
had a head start.
We had a head start.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when we go around thinking, well, I'm so great, I have this big house and I'm so successful, just like it's good for us as Canadians to just stop for a minute and just think, well, where did that come from? How is it that I got here? And there's a lot of richness that will come from the answers to those questions.
In the book, you outline how the Northern Store, just outside the Manitoba First Nation of Garden Hill, contributes to the community's social problems, like you said. Could you explain how the Northern Store differs from the store your family runs in Emo, Ontario?
Well, it's not hugely different. The Northern Store in Garden Hills are remote communities, so you only 6 weeks of the year can you drive into it over the winter roads, so the food is flown in for the most part, and the diabetes is crazy. And as taxpayers, we also need to ask some questions, because every dialysis bed there is $1 million, and there's a huge waiting list for dialysis.
How many beds do they have?
Well, there's I believe 8 beds there, but there's 38 people on a waiting list to get dialysis, and also it's $100,000 a year per patient, dialysis patient in Garden Hill. And yet the federal government's food policy is subsidizing the Northern Store's activities, and the Northern Store sells mostly unhealthy food. And then there we have a social enterprise called Meacham. Meacham, it's a 13-acre farm, 500 chickens at a time, lots of, there's an orchard, eggs, tomatoes, carrots, potatoes. None of that activity is supported by the federal government at all. And we have to compete against the Northern Store that gets in, and a few other smaller retailers, they get $1 million a year now in Garden Hill, in a place called Garden Hill, where clearly they're so proud of their history of local food production that that's how they chose to name their First Nation. It's all screwed up. And if the federal government just stops for a minute and says, hey, maybe we need to support problem solvers, and then maybe the problem will go away, I think we'll get a lot further. And that's why I wrote the book.
I always was under the impression that the reason why the food is flown in is because nothing can grow there.
Well, you can buy salmon at the Northern Store from BC, but you can't buy local fish. And the lake is teeming with fish. So the social enterprise we have, a nonprofit business, it won't sell unhealthy food, and it'll only do things that are going to promote employment in the community. And
so better food, better health, less money too.
And we have 10 people that work seasonally, but full-time on the farm, and that's pretty exciting. And the kids can see their parents going out the door in the morning to work and contributing, and it's emotionally a healthy activity as well, farming and gardening. And but this is not going to be widespread. I mean, one of the reasons why we chose Garden Hill as its name, because we know where there's bad outcomes, bad government policy isn't too far away. And sure enough, you can see where they're supporting in Garden Hill problem makers rather than problem solvers. And our push with the federal government right now is that you've got to start to change your focus.
I want to show a map of Nutrition North Canada, and it shows the remote communities served by the federal government's Nutrition North program. Could you explain how that program works? Well,
it's a transportation subsidy. So food is flown in, and they try to offset the cost of the high cost of flying food in. But the problem is that not so much that, but that it's the money is going to retailers that have no competition. And anyone who's taken a basic economics course or class will know that a monopoly for-profit retailer is going to sell their product for what they can get. And that's why the prices are high. So there needs to be more competition. And the federal government should not be giving money to retailers that are making people sick. And I don't think, Nam, they have any big intention. They're doing a review right now, Nutrition North Canada.
You don't think they'll change it?
I don't think they're going to do
even if it's broken?
Anything significant. And so our choice as social enterprise developers is that we're going to push hard, and we're not going to stop until they realize that, yes, you can garden in Garden Hill, you can fish in Garden Hill, you can hunt, and you can have an economy where people are employed and providing for their families.
I want to take a look back at history. What lessons could we stand to learn from campaigns run by the Canadian Department of Agriculture during the World Wars?
During the World Wars, with so many people leaving to go and fight overseas, the government instituted victory gardens. And I talked to my 85-year-old dad in Emo, Ontario, and so yeah, we had victory gardens, like even in an agricultural place. And my father-in-law in Winnipeg, they remember these victory gardens, and they were everywhere. And at one time, everybody gardened in their front yards, but it came to be a status symbol that to have lawns. And so lawns overtook gardens. And, you know, I often wonder, I started wondering about 10 years ago, wow, it's just strange. And we go out and cut the grass and we put these chemicals and stuff on it. Wouldn't it make more sense just to plant it?
And to grow things you can eat.
Yeah, so this is the shift. The paradigm is shifting, and it's going to start shifting quickly, where we're going to see in parks, we're going to see edible landscaping. We're going to see more people gardening in their own yards and buying local foods, and we'll all be much healthier for that. And so the local food movement is a big component of this solutions economy. So in Winnipeg, and I'm sure this is the case in some institutions in Southern Ontario, but in Winnipeg, University of Winnipeg has Diversity Foods. It's a social enterprise that looks after all of their food needs on campus. And 60% of their food purchases are from farmers that don't use chemicals and pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. And so that helps clean up Lake Winnipeg. It helps put more people in rural Manitoba. It cuts down on the amount of processed food. Like there's all kinds of enormous benefits.
Yeah.
But our entire Department of Agriculture is completely focused on big agriculture, which is very high in fossil fuel usage and is causing problems. So the paradigm that's shifting, it's going to shift quickly towards the solutions economy, and I'm very excited about that.
We're running out of time, and I wanted to talk, we have a guest waiting to talk to us on Skype. Tell me about Build. What is it?
Well, Build, we're very excited. It celebrated 10 years this year, and that was our first experience with a social enterprise. And as I say, we've lowered utility bills at 16,000 low-income households. It's about $4 or $5 million a year reduction in people's bills. And we've hired and trained about 500 people to move into the labor market by using that work. And so Build we now do chemical-free, different enterprises, chemical-free bedbug remediation. We have an ethical temporary agency. We do geothermal and food on First Nations, and soon biomass on First Nations, and apartment renovations as well. And we have some important partners across the country, usually public housing providers, and they like to do business with us because we hire their tenants. And so yeah, Build is just an amazing journey, a life journey for me and for the people who have worked there.
Well, I wanted to introduce someone else to the conversation, and joining us from Winnipeg, Manitoba via Skype, Chris Courchene. He is a former Build employee, now a supervisor with Manitoba Green Retrofit. Welcome, Chris.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you over there?
We're great. Can you tell us how you became involved with Build?
I just got out of jail, and I asked my probation officer, I said, hey, I don't want to keep going back to jail. What do I do? And she says, well, I heard of this company called Build Inc., and they help people like you.
What kind of work did you do for Build?
I was doing retrofits, energy retrofits, energy efficient retrofits. We were insulating basements, insulating attics, insulating exterior walls. We were also doing water retrofits, installing low flow toilets, water water aerator installations, stuff like that.
And how did it feel to be able to work and to provide for your family?
Oh, it was a lot different than what I was doing, I'll tell you that much. It felt good because I worked in the low-income neighborhoods. That's the area I grew up in. So I'm helping the people that I grew up seeing, you know, in the area, especially the north end of Winnipeg.
And Shaun, I want to ask you, how does focusing on installation in homes make sense for Build?
Well, it's we didn't have a lot of competitors in that area, so it was a good place to go to, and we thought public housing would be an easy sell for them if we were to hire some of their tenants and at the same time reduce their bills. So it's just a huge win-win-win.
Mm-hmm. And you write in your book, you wrote that when you first started Build, you thought that people like Chris were write-offs. What changed your mind?
I just didn't know. And Chris, when you and I first met, like, he didn't have a driver's license. He had no work experience. I just didn't understand him. Mm-hmm. And so the driver's licensing is an excellent thing we like to talk about to show the difference. So my kids are going through driver's training right now.
At 16, right?
Yeah, well, and it's just easy, mm-hmm. and their parents have vehicles to practice drive.
Money for the lessons.
Well, when I met Chris, he didn't have a driver's license. 75% of job postings require a driver's license now. And so if we're serious about reducing poverty, we need to focus on things that make people successful. And I know it's the same in Ontario, there's just no focus on it. And so Chris got his driver's license at Build. He also participated in parenting programs along with trades-based tutoring and WHMIS, first aid, CPR, all of these things to make somebody successful. And he's a great dad mm-hmm. now. And you know, in Manitoba, we have 10,000 kids in care, 8,900 of them Indigenous. And if Chris wasn't working, it's quite possible that his kids would be in care as well. And it's just, there's no need for it. We need to focus on the problem solvers, and Chris is an excellent example of that.
Chris, I wanted to ask you, when people found out that you had a criminal history at the places that you were working, what was their reaction to that?
There was a lot of like whispering and stuff like that, like well, there was no trust. There was a lot of doubt, especially when I go in and put in resumes and stuff like that.
How did you deal with all that?
I kept on saying, like, something's gonna happen, something will happen, like there has to be some sort of hope out there for a person like me or people like me. Like, you know, just because I'm branded as an ex-con doesn't mean I'm not good to do something good for my society, you know.
How did Shaun help you?
Shaun, man, he helped change my life forever. Like, that guy, he put my interests before his own. Like, he said, here's a door, do you want to walk through it? But you have to walk through it, basically. And I said, yeah, man. I said, you know, I'm tired of living the way I live. Just show me what to do, show me how to do it, and, you know, I'll do anything, just as long as my family doesn't have to live the life that I lived.
I'm getting emotional listening to that. You provided the opportunity, and it's a ripple effect now.
Yeah, so the way social enterprises, we're a group, we're a nonprofit, so it's a lot of us, and I'm a big part of that, and Chris is a big part of it. But we change each other's lives. I think that's what's really important. And at Build, where Chris started, we have stacks and piles of resumes, and maybe
4,000 or something.
Oh, easily, yeah, over time. Mm-hmm. So there's a myth that we need to deal with in Canada, and that's that the Indigenous community and the low-income community don't want to work. And so Chris is one of our main recruiters now, right? So he's got cousins and friends that want to work with our group of social enterprises. And make no mistake about it, we hired Chris because he had a criminal record. And that's what reconciliation is all about. It changes the power dynamics and puts the power back in the community and into Indigenous communities. And Chris's kids can now see him going out the door every day, participating in the economy. And he goes and he speaks at schools too. And so he can tell kids, you know, you don't have to get involved in gangs. There are places where you can go that will hire. But we've done all this primarily fighting government, despite of government. And when government really starts to get on side, social procurement, for example, in Scotland, there are 1,500 social enterprises that hire people with barriers to employment. And in Southern Ontario here, there might be only a handful. So we've really got to get serious about encouraging enterprises like Build everywhere. What
keeps you going if you're having pushback, all this pushback?
Well, it's just exciting, I think, to be a part of Chris's life and to know what's possible. And I think we're almost there. There's many senior civil servants in INAC, in the federal government, that are super excited about this new model and doing business differently and engaging First Nations in a different way. And once the institutional mechanisms start to push that, just imagine the impact of the Indian agent 100 years ago, and imagine what a decolonizing approach would look like in our urban inner city neighborhoods and on our First Nations. It will change Canada.
Shaun, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Nam.
And Chris, thank you so much for joining us from Winnipeg.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit tvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.